I may just hit. 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 Oscar, can you hear me okay?
Okay,
Everybody
right
say,
now.
okay. Was it not
But
good?
before we cannot hear you anything.
Can't hear or see anything?
You're in a loop.
Yeah, we can see right now and we can hear, but before it repeating, the sound
Okay.
is not working before.
I
Right
love,
now it's okay.
right now it's working. Okay,
Yeah.
Yes, now it's
I'm
working.
I just love this. Don't you just love this? I just love this. Oh yeah, this is,
That was fun.
now it's fine. Okay, let's just go for it. Hi, Don. Good to hear from you. Technology is such wonderful stuff when it works. It can be such an impenetrable jungle when something goes wrong. My old headset didn't work, and so I've got this new headset, and I probably should have spent more money to get something better, but this is the one I've got. And, oh man, maybe I'll get something with a cord on it instead of this wireless nutcase. So anyway, here we are at Joseph and Moses. Joseph goes down into Egypt around 1925 or so BC. His dates are a little hard to know exactly. We don't have totally good information on Joseph, but we know he was down before 1900 BC. Joseph is the firstborn of Jacob and Rachel. Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. He had so many, and he had children by everybody. He had with 12 boys, and we don't even know how many girls. There's one that's mentioned. We see him at age 17 shepherding flocks, and he has a lot of special privileges. Joseph is a bit of a spoiled boy. We know that he had a coat of many colors, which was a signal probably of his place in the inheritance. We don't know for sure. The Bible actually doesn't tell us what the coat of many colors was about, and we don't have any explanation outside of the Bible. So it'll be interesting to get to heaven and find out what that was, or maybe one of these days we'll run into something that gives us a better insight. Joseph had dreams. The really important part of the Joseph story is all the dreams. So Joseph had dreams. Later on, the cupbearer and the baker had dreams, and the Pharaoh had dreams. Everybody's having dreams, and Joseph interacting with the dream narratives is a big deal. The ancient world was a great place for dreams. There's a lot of detail about dreams in all of the ancient literature. We find that every king, every potentate had his collection of wise men. Included among them was always those who could interpret dreams. So Joseph's ability to interpret dreams while he was in Egypt is not necessarily a terribly unusual thing. Well, what's really unusual with Joseph is that his interpretations were correct. They were God-given and therefore actually predicted the future. The dream interpretation done by the various wise men of Egypt was not nearly as likely to be correct, which makes the whole thing interesting. I just enjoy the stories. This photograph is of the Dothan Valley in northern Israel. This is north of a place in the Central Hill Country called Shechem. Joseph was sent by his father Jacob to look for his brothers. Now, at the time, Jacob would have been in the south between Hebron and Beersheba, way in the south of Israel in the Negev. And the boys had gone north. The older brothers had taken the flocks of sheep and goats north along the hill country route, looking for food, looking for pasture. Now, it must have been a dry year because they had gone as far north as Shechem, which is about 25 kilometers north of Jerusalem. And the whole hill country, most years, has pasture. It gets enough rain that this is usually not a problem. This year, it must have been a drier than usual year. They ended up north of Shechem, several kilometers, in a place called the Dothan Valley. And this photograph shows that today, there's still not many people living in the Dothan Valley. The farmers who work the Dothan Valley today typically live in the villages nearby. Dothan Valley today is owned mostly by Palestinian Arabs who have farmed this area for the last couple of hundred years. The Jews don't technically own the Dothan Valley. It's a part of what we call the West Bank, and is in Palestinian operated territory. in biblical times, it was a fairly isolated spot. And the brothers with their flocks would have been wandering in this valley, or more likely up on the hillsides. The valley was probably cultivated, so they would have been around the hillsides that you can see here. From that vantage point, they would have been in a good position to notice a caravan of camels heading past. These were the Ishmaelite or Midianite traders who were heading for Egypt. And they chose to sell Joseph to the slave traders, the Ishmaelites. This gives us all kinds of insight, and it opens up the whole question of slavery in the ancient world. Slavery was actually a very common situation in the ancient world. There were essentially two classes in the ancient world. There was a very tiny ruling class made up of the kings and their court, and the temple, the priesthood, and all of their hangers-on. Those would be extraordinarily wealthy people with all of the privileges. The vast majority of people were either free subjects of a king and peasants, in other words, serfs on the land, or they would be slaves, actually owned by somebody. The difference between a peasant and a slave has to do with ownership. And in Egypt, most of the people were peasants. They had no education, they had no source of income apart from the land, and they worked at whatever they could in order to survive. Slavery normally put the individual slave into whatever circumstance his owner decided to put him. The slave belonged to a master and could be killed or imprisoned, anything that the master wanted. Slaves had no rights at all. The price for a slave, as I recall, 20 pieces of silver, is not a great deal of money. That's about 2 weeks' wages for a working man. So Joseph's price of slavery was not very much. And it's a fairly consistent price for slavery throughout most of the ancient world. Jesus was sold by Judas Iscariot for 30 pieces of silver, which is not a lot of inflation over a period of 2,000 years. So there we are, Dothan Valley, and Joseph, grabbed by the slave traders, hauled off to Egypt, where he becomes the household servant of a character by the name of Potiphar. And Potiphar is an interesting character. He's a high up administrator of some sort in the Egyptian hierarchy. So a wealthy man. And Potiphar would have owned a great house. In a great house, there would be lots of people, lots of servants, lots of slaves. The lady of the household, Potiphar's wife, would have had as many slaves as she wanted. And all of these various people would be in and out and back and forth and doing the things that needed to get done in a great house, whatever that happened to be. Potiphar was an important character in the Egyptian government, and he was often on the road. As I've mentioned before, Egypt is a long, skinny country. And if you're in one part of the country, you need to get to the other part of the country. It's a long time by boat. You have to sail upstream and then drift with the water downstream. And it's never very quick. It's usually quicker to go by water than to walk, but only just barely. It's likely that Joseph came down into Egypt during the last years of what we call the Middle Kingdom. You'll recall that Egyptian history is divided up into an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a late kingdom. And there are intermediate stages in between the old and the middle and the late. The Middle Kingdom began around 2050 or so BC and ends about 1800 BC. So about a 250-year period of Middle Egypt. The Middle Kingdom is distinctive in a whole bunch of ways. So this is a tomb from the Middle Kingdom, and we can see some of the characteristics of the Egyptians of this time. They're busy preparing a nobleman for burial. Hieroglyphics on the wall. The hieroglyphics of the period are written in a distinctive Middle Egyptian dialect. Middle Egyptian is different from the Old Egyptian and different also from the New Kingdom, the Late Kingdom, Egypt. It's not dramatically different. Egyptologists can tell the difference. People like me just have to take their word for it. But the Egyptian is distinctive. The customs of the time are fairly significant. There's a lot of things that we can trace. For instance, the kind of clothing that people wear. You'll notice that for the most part, the men in this picture are wearing just a kind of a kilt. The lady who is involved has a more elaborate dress. They have necklaces on. Those seem to be a Middle Kingdom thing. And it has to do something with the sun god. The hair that you see on their heads is wigs. The Egyptians typically shaved their heads. They shaved their whole bodies, I'm told, but they shaved their heads and wore wigs. And they would pour perfume on the wigs and put them on their heads. It was a different kind of thing. The Syrians, non-Egyptians who came down into Egypt from Syria, had hair and beards, and they were hairy all over, and they fooled around with sheep. In general, the Egyptians considered non-Egyptians to be not very clean people. The non-Egyptians to the west were the nomadic people, the Bedouin, who came in out of the Sahara Desert. There are relatively few of those, and they were considered unclean. The more frequent visitors came from the northeast, from Syria, and Joseph and his brothers would have been considered a part of that group. The story that surrounds Joseph is full of the local color, names, customs, interactions among people that relate to the Middle Kingdom Egyptian society. Certainly not the later Hyksos society. The Hyksos were a Semitic people, a nomadic people, whose warlords took over in Egypt from about 1800 to about 1550 BC, about a 250-year period. It's important from a biblical chronological point of view to see Joseph in Egypt prior to the Hyksos period. So he was accepted into Egypt, and Jacob was later invited into Egypt by Middle Egyptian people, not by the Hyksos. Those who hold to a later date or a non-biblical date for the Exodus primarily will often want to put Joseph in Egypt during the Hyksos period. This is a big controversy amongst scholars. If you read commentaries, one of the ways that you can tell that something is wrong with the commentary is if the date for Joseph is given as during the Hyksos period. They're just wrong. All of the names, the customs, the language, and a whole lot more point to a thoroughly Egyptian background. So the Bible puts Joseph in Egypt around 1900 BC. We know that Jacob came down to Egypt by 1876 or so. The book of Exodus tells us that the people of Israel at the time of the Exodus had been in Egypt for 430 years. The Egyptian Exodus happens in 1446 BC. That's set up by we'll talk about this a little more later, but the key dates, one of the key dates for the Old Testament is the Exodus. The main criterion for dating the Exodus is in 1 Kings 6:1. We're told that the Exodus happened 480 years prior to the dedication of Solomon's temple. We know Solomon's dates very well. And so by dating 480 years prior to the dedication of Solomon's temple, we get 1446 BC. By adding another 430 years, we get 1876 BC. So 1876, 1446, and whatever it is, 966 BC. Those are the three dates that are hard dates for biblical chronology. Those are what are given in the Bible and are repeated numerous times. Now, the 430-year period is a little controversial because the Stephen's speech in the book of Acts puts it at 400 years. That could be simply a rounding. And at any rate, it doesn't make all that much difference. The hard date is 1446 BC, and we call that the early date for the Exodus. A lot of argument around all of that. Any arguments for other date systems than what I've just given you have to assume that the Bible is wrong. I don't like to start there. Sometimes there are textual problems. Sometimes individual details of numbers can give us trouble. But most of the time, the safe way to begin is to assume that the Bible has got it right, especially when the Bible repeats a background date several times and when it has emphasis. So enough for that. Here's Joseph in Egypt. We know that he had a position in a great house, part of the nobility. This fits very well with what we know of this period. The pyramid at Saqqara, which is what we see in the background here, was being built during the time of Joseph. So around 1900 BC, this is a very old piece of work. Now, at the time that the Saqqara stage pyramid was being built, the Great Pyramids at Giza were already ancient. They were already 1,000 years old, roughly. So Joseph is operating in the upper echelons of a very, very wealthy society. Okay, what else can we show you here? The position of a household servant, very, very important. The papyrus fragment here on the left lists the servants in an Egyptian household. Yeah, you just have to take my word for it. There are 79 separate servants with their own particular specialties in this very large household. The tomb painting that you see in the background shows an Egyptian servant at work. We don't know exactly what he's doing. We've got one guy with a scythe. He's cutting grain. Maybe the other fella is a baker working for the nobleman. This is the kind of household that Joseph would have gone into. We know that Joseph was given a chariot to ride. Now, later on, during the New Kingdom, after the Hyksos, the Egyptians did have chariots. They certainly had chariots. They learned about chariots from the Hyksos. This is a picture of Ramses II, some 200 years after the Exodus, riding in his chariot. But when Joseph had his chariot, it was about 500 years before Ramses, and the chariot that Joseph had was certainly not a war chariot. The use of chariots for warfare as weapon platforms was not invented until at least 1800 BC by the Hyksos in this area. They probably learned it from the Hittites in Turkey. So Joseph probably had like a ceremonial horse-drawn cart. It wasn't designed for combat. It wasn't a lightweight basket. It was probably a fairly heavy thing, and probably fairly ornate. And it was Joseph's main job to see to it that grain was collected during the years of plenty. And then he sold it all back to the people during the time of the famine. And Joseph has been attacked on ethics charges. What kind of a socialist is Joseph anyway? And in fact, I think we can question what Joseph did there, but it was ultimately it was a part of what was necessary in order for the people of Israel to be brought down into Egypt. God is working on a much larger canvas, and the Egyptians had already been subjugated. This is simply an increase in their subjugation. I'm not excusing the ethics charges, but Joseph was simply a part of a much larger pattern that was going on here at the time. Okay, I want to finish up the Joseph narrative with something kind of interesting. There's some fun stuff that's going on in recent research. We know that Joseph went down into Egypt around 1800. He rose to power and provided a place for Jacob around 1876. And so Joseph would have lived in a fairly substantial house of his own. After he'd left Potiphar's household and gone to work for the Pharaoh, he would have had his own great house. The Great House would have been set up most likely in the style of Syria, in a Semitic style. And he would have been surrounded by family. And there in that great house in Egypt, Joseph would have grown old. And he would have been buried in a tomb there in Egypt, where he stayed for the 400 or so years until the Exodus happened, and his bones were carried up from Egypt onto the Promised Land. So, if we were looking for evidence of Joseph in Egypt, we would be looking for a place with archaeological roots going back into the Middle Kingdom, and we would be looking for a Syrian type of great house. Now, as it happens, Egyptian and British archaeologists have been working in Egypt for years and years and years. This map gives you a little bit. This is again the satellite map. The sites of Pithom and Ramesses are somewhat questionable. They're both mentioned in the Exodus narratives, and we wish we knew exactly, but we think we're probably right. Ramesses we're quite sure of. I'm going to show you a cutaway of Ramesses in a moment. Ramesses is a city that is most famous for the time of Ramses II. It was built with palaces and all kinds of interesting stuff in the late 13s and early 1200s BC. And that place has been excavated for over 100 years. Beginning about 40 years ago, actually an Austrian-German character by the name of Manfred Bietak has been excavating at Ramesses, and he dug to the next level down and found a settlement quite a lot earlier than Ramesses that we call Avaris. And let me show you the cutaway. So Avaris and Ramesses are on the same site. So there's Ramesses. It has been excavated. Manfred Bietak then excavated Avaris. And what's interesting about Avaris, it dates to around 1800, 1850 BC in that general area. And the location of Avaris is just to the north of the Delta Wadi area that we call the Wadi Tumilat. Tumilat is the land of Goshen, very likely where the people of Israel lived. So here's a noble settlement that would later on become the site of a king's mansion on the north side of the Wadi Tumilat. So what could it be? So when we look at it, this is an artist's conception of the settlement. What we have is in fact all in ruins. It's an archaeological site. But look what has been reconstructed here. In the background, that white building is the great house itself. That's the mansion that the owner of this household would have lived in. The building off to the right, in kind of a brown, is another palatial building. The little buildings that you see in the middle distance are tombs. Lots and lots of little tombs. And each of those little tombs would have been a place for half a dozen or a dozen people. These would be tombs that belong to the family of whoever the great man was who owned this this mansion. Now, what we see here is a great house built in what is called the Syrian style. The Egyptian style is quite distinctive. The Syrian style is more like the Mesopotamian style, with a courtyard surrounded by 2 stories of house all the way around, and that's what we see here. This is a Syrian style of household. On the left here, the conspicuous pyramid is obviously a tomb, and is quite different from all of the other tombs in this compound. This tomb obviously belonged to the great man, the nobleman who originated this particular great house. And we see a statue of him nearby. Now, this is the head of that statue, which is about all that's left. And as you can see, it's not in very good condition. The suggestion is, I think it's a good suggestion, that this is the household of Joseph, and this statue is Joseph. Now, there are no names and there are no inscriptions. What we have is exactly the right date and exactly the right architectural style for this to be Joseph. That small pyramid tomb, of course, is empty. Nothing at all inside it, as though it was cleaned out, and probably was by the Israelites when they left Egypt on their way out with the Exodus. So I think we found Joseph's household, and we may even have a picture of him. I don't know what kind of hat that is that he's wearing. Was he wearing a turban in Egypt? I don't know, but that's who he is. Okay, the next great character in the biblical chronology is Moses. He's introduced in the book of Exodus, and of course he's the famous baby in a basket. The name Moses is not a Hebrew name; it's an Egyptian name. His name was given to him by the daughter of Pharaoh, who pulled him out of the river. The word Moshe is very common in Egyptian. Ramses, for example, Ra Masas, okay, which means the great god Ra, the sun god, brings forth. Okay, so MSS, Masas, is to draw forth or to bring forth. And we find that name, Tutmosis, the pharaoh who probably grew up with Moses in the royal household, has the same name. Tut is one of the gods of Egypt. The great god Tut brings forth, and it's a reference to the birth of the king. Moses, he is drawn forth. What did the daughter of Pharaoh do? She went to the river and drew him forth from the river. It's a fairly easy name to figure out. And it's interesting that it's an Egyptian name and not a Hebrew name, although it does transliterate nicely into Hebrew. So Moses is introduced with the famous baby in a basket story. Yes, it's somewhat unbelievable that a thing like that could happen. And yet, when we study the history of the period, it becomes more likely. His birth would have happened around 1525 BC. That would put him at about the same age as Tutmosis III, who reigned from 1490 to 1450 BC. Now, keep those dates in mind because Thutmose III is a very, very important king. He would have been 35 years old at the time he ascended to the throne, which is a little late. His father, whose name escapes me right now, would have died significantly before that. Ahmose I drove the Hyksos out in 1525 BC. His son then reigned until about 1500 BC. So there's about a 10-year period there when somebody else reigned in Egypt. That somebody is a woman by the name of Hatshepsut, who's a very interesting character. Hatshepsut was a daughter of Ahmose I, so a daughter of Pharaoh, an important woman in the Egyptian household, in the royal household. And Hatshepsut would have been a young woman in her 20s or early 30s at the time that Moses was born. Thutmose would have been born about the same time. The two of them likely grew up in the same household, shared the same education, and came under the influence of the same Hatshepsut, daughter of Pharaoh. Between Moses and Thutmose, there's a tremendous jealousy. They both grew up in the same household, yet Thutmose would have been the favorite of his father to be the next Pharaoh. The firstborn was always considered the god, and therefore the next king in line. Hatshepsut, I believe, is the daughter of Pharaoh who pulled Moses out of the river and intended for Moses to be the next king of Egypt. The two of them would have shared the same education. They would have shared the same privileges. They would have been jealous of one another in Egypt. This may explain why Moses was afraid of punishment after his murder of the Egyptian in Exodus chapter 1. That's why he stayed in exile for 40 years. Thutmose referred to himself, he's a very interesting character, as the conqueror of Syria. Thutmose was very, very hard on Syria. Thutmose would not have been a good time for the Israelites to enter Egypt. They would have been slaves under Thutmose. The hieroglyphs that you see in the background here and the temple structure that you see here dates to the time of Thutmose III. The hornet that you see in the center hieroglyph is the hieroglyph that pictures Thutmose III. He's the hornet. He's got a big stinger. He's going to go out and get you. 3 times in the Bible, once in Leviticus and twice in Joshua, as I recall, God either promises to or claims that he has sent the hornet before you. Sent the hornet. The interesting thing, hornet, or sometimes translated wasp. The hornet was the work of Thutmose III in weakening Syria in preparation for the Exodus and then the conquest by Israel. Israel was supposed to leave Egypt in 1446 BC. And with a stop at Sinai, they should have gone directly on under Moses to conquer Canaan from the miscellaneous Canaanite people groups who lived in the land at that time. Why they held back is a whole nother story. But Thutmose III, in 18 campaigns, literally took Canaan apart. The Canaanite city-states, some 130 of them, were subject to the Egyptians during that time. And the young nobility of Egypt, from Thutmose III on through all of the Egyptian dynasties that followed him, would take the young nobility of the Canaanite city-states back to Egypt, where they learned how to kiss up to Pharaoh and how to undercut one another. They were trained that you have to absolutely obey and be obedient to Pharaoh, and you have to rat out one another. This was a terrible thing that Tutmosis initiated. And later on, when the people of Israel finally crossed the river, crossed the Jordan, and began the conquest, they discovered here a very broken set of warring nations. They simply couldn't unite around the common cause of resisting Israel. Okay, let me spend a little bit more time with Hatshepsut because she's a fascinating character. This is the tomb of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Pharaoh, and I believe that she is the only character possible. The Bible doesn't give us this name. This name we take from history. But Hatshepsut is the only woman who ruled over Egypt. She's the aunt of Thutmosis III. She usurped the throne for between 8 and 12 years. It's difficult to tell. She's the only famous woman ruler in the period. The next major character that we see in Egypt is Cleopatra, some 1,500 years later. So it's a long time between. She's the only one who could possibly have gotten away with saving one of the Hebrew children, who was Moses. This is her tomb, which is the greatest of all of the tombs, not in the Egyptian Valley of the Queens. There are 3 valleys for tombs in the Luxor region of Egypt. There's the Valley of the Kings, which is very famous. There's the Valley of the Queens, where the female royalty are buried. And then there is the Valley of the Nobles, the noblemen, where noble families have their tombs. And these are all grandiose, magnificent things. But this is one of the greatest of them all. And it is found not in the Valley of the Queens, where you would expect it, but in the Valley of the Kings. And at the head of the valley, when you walk into the Valley of the Kings, this is the first temple that is found. This is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. Inside, we find, among other things, this statue of Hatshepsut. And she was apparently, at least when she was younger, a very pretty woman. She's obviously very much in the noble form. She holds herself regally with all of that. Most of the places that we see Hatshepsut pictured, however, she looks more like this. This is a sphinx made out of Aswan red granite that we find in the in the New York Metropolitan Museum. And you'll notice something that's funny here. She has an artificial or a fake beard. Most of the statues of Hatshepsut that were found in the mortuary temple itself have the fake beard, but they also have the face hacked off. The people of Egypt did not appreciate Hatshepsut very much. At any rate, here's Hatshepsut, very famous character. And the beard is kind of a funny thing. Okay, what have I got here? After the death of Hatshepsut, we can, let's see, can I make this go? Yeah, Moses in Egypt. Let's see if I can get this to go. The son of Tutmosis III is, oh, shoot, okay. My thing is messed up. Okay, we have to talk about this. Tutmosis III is the pharaoh of the oppression. This is a picture of bricks, mud bricks being made in Egypt today. You can see an Egyptian workman in the background, busy making bricks. You can see lots and lots of straw. Bricks are made with straw. You mix the straw is actually chopped up into a kind of chaff and mixed with the mud. This changes the molecular consistency of the mud and makes it a considerably tougher material. So building with straw is actually really, really important. We see this also in wall paintings. The background here is supposed to be a wall painting of Egyptian slaves making bricks during the biblical period. So the technique has actually not changed at all. Modern Egyptians still build lots of things, including households out in the countryside out of mud bricks, because it's good, easily available building materials. Okay, Tutmosis III is best remembered for his Megiddo campaign, which happened shortly after Hatshepsut died, and we'll look at Megiddo a little later. He's also famous for enslaving the Israelites. They made bricks, and then eventually without straw. Tough times. Okay, the 10 plagues in Egypt happened during the lifetime of Amenhotep II. Tutmosis III died in 1450. His son is Amenhotep II, and that has to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. If anybody ever asks you, Walt Disney is wrong. The Prince of Egypt movie, which is great fun to watch and it's got some great music in it, is completely wrong. Moses and Ramses didn't grow up together. It was Moses and Tutmosis III. The pharaoh of the Exodus is Amenhotep II. The son of Amenhotep II is a character named Tutmosis IV. And I have to show you this picture of the Sphinx. And I could never get between the legs of the Sphinx, but you can see this big Sphinx. This is the famous Sphinx up on the plateau of Giza, with several of the pyramids of Giza in the background. And some of my students are there looking over at the Sphinx. Between the legs of the Sphinx, there are several large stone tablets. One of them is called the Dream Stele. This thing stands about 3 meters high. It's a great big stone tablet. And Tutmosis IV claims that the Sphinx had spoken to him in a dream and promised him the throne, in spite of the fact that he was the second son of Amenhotep II. Now, that's the only place that we're told that. The firstborn of Amenhotep II died. Wow, that's unusual. And for a second son to be the pharaoh is a very unusual thing. The dream stele explains, sort of, that the gods were actually in all of this, and that Tutmosis IV was actually going to get to be a god after all, even though he was born merely human. So we have to ask the question, what happened to the firstborn of Amenhotep II? And the answer, of course, is the Passover, when the angel of God, the angel of death, came through Egypt to kill all of the firstborn, from the firstborn of the slave to the firstborn of the palace. The firstborn of Amenhotep II died. There's a mummy in Egypt, and I've decided not to give you that picture, that we call the screaming mummy. Is an obviously unpleasant death, and it's an Egyptian royalty because it's buried in one of the great tombs, but the face looks like it was frozen in horror. And some have asked, is this the firstborn of Amenhotep II who died in the Passover? It's possible. The dates are about right. So, 10 plagues. The 10th plague is the death of the firstborn, but the 10 plagues on Egypt are a fascinating thing. The Egyptian literature really doesn't give us much about this. Most countries don't give long lists of all of their catastrophes for reasons that are obvious. And the Egyptians are no different than anybody else. The 10 plagues on Egypt must have had a significant impact on the nation, though. If the Bible is to be believed, these were supernatural events. In other words, they weren't just natural stuff that happens all the time. The river doesn't routinely turn to blood. Gnats don't routinely take over the place. These were supernatural. They exceeded the natural laws. The interesting thing about the plagues on Egypt is that each of them seems to have had a relationship to a specific Egyptian god. There are lots and lots of Egyptian gods, and all of them have a relationship to the natural world. So the Nile is a god. Well, what better way to demonstrate the impotency of the god Nile than to turn the Nile into blood? The sun is a god, Ra or Amun or Amun-Re. And what better way to say, here's what I think of your gods, than to say the sun won't shine. You're going to have nothing but darkness. You think your priests can make the sun shine. Well, here's what we think of your priests. And each of the 10 plagues can be related specifically to an Egyptian god. It's as though God is thumbing his nose at the so-called gods of Egypt. The 10th plague is the last straw, of course. The people of Israel were not only allowed to leave, they were driven out. They were expelled from Egypt. This shot gives you a pretty good bird's eye view of the Exodus route itself. The story of the Exodus assumes a knowledge of the geography of Egypt and of the Sinai. It really helps to have a map in front of you while you're looking at things. One of our biggest problems is that the a lot of the names given in the Exodus account and in the Numbers account are hard to relate to the facts on the ground. But the gross geography remains the same. In the left side of this picture, you see the Nile Delta at the top. The Wadi Tumilat, which is the land of Goshen, is a little strip of green that goes between the Delta and the Great Bitter Lakes. It's up toward the top of this image. Off to the left-hand side of the image, the Nile River goes off to the south. In the center of this image is the Sinai Peninsula, with the Gulf of Suez on the left and the Gulf of Eilat or Aqaba on the right, on either side of the Sinai Peninsula. The north end of the Sinai is very dry, deep blowing sand dunes and whatnot. It's a fairly inhospitable place, except right along the coast. Farther south is an area of sandstone mountains. It's a very rugged, very difficult to pass through wasteland. The problem in the northern Sinai is that one, it rains very seldom, and two, when it does rain, the water drains right through the sand and disappears. It is so deep that the Bedouin can't get to it. There are very, very few oasis areas in the northern Sinai. You can see the change of color between the northern Sinai and the southern Sinai. Southern Sinai is a red granite, similar to the red granite of Aswan in southern Egypt. It's a hard, waterproof granite, and it makes for steep-sided, very hard mountains. But at the base of those mountains, the valleys collect a bit of soil, and in that soil is often a bit of water. And so pasture grows in the southern Sinai. And the Bedouin have learned how to get water in the southern Sinai. To this day, the Bedouin people continue to live in the southern Sinai. Only caravans, or motorized vehicles, of course, pass through the northern Sinai. The southern Sinai continues to be a place where the Bedouin tribes people can live. That's just background, and it gives us a perspective that we're going to need as we talk about how the route of the Sinai could have happened. Now, the two arms of water, Gulf of Suez on the left and the Gulf of Eilat on the right, both drain into the much larger Red Sea. People talk about the crossing of the Red Sea. Well, we can say that they crossed an arm of the Red Sea, and that's okay. That would put the crossing up in the northwest corner of this picture, across the Gulf of Suez. There are some scholars who put the crossing over across the Gulf of Eilat in the southeast corner of the Sinai, at that narrow spot at the south end of the Gulf of Eilat. The Red Sea itself is completely out of the question. So where does the term come from? The term Red Sea in Hebrew is actually Yam Suf, which means literally a sea of reeds. Now that would fit the Gulf of Suez. Unfortunately, it also fits very well the string of lakes that we call the Great Bitter Lakes. I'm going to give you another map here. This one is a little better for what we're looking at. Between the Gulf of Suez and the Mediterranean Sea today is the Suez Canal. Along that Suez Canal is a string of lakes, like Timsah and like whatever. There's a string of lakes. They are brackish, that is, they're salty lakes. They're not particularly pleasant places, but they do grow reeds. Papyrus reeds grow in that place. They also grow in the Gulf of Suez. These are common places to get papyrus. So any of this water could be called Yam Suf, or Sea of Reeds. Interestingly, Herodotus uses the term Thalassa Erythra, the Red Sea, to refer to the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba or Eilat, and the Red Sea. So he is almost no help at all. Where is the Sea of Reeds? It could be the Gulf of Suez, or it could be in the Great Bitter Lakes. The routes that you see on this map amount to 4 in particular. There are 2 northern routes. The northernmost, right along the edge of the ocean, is called the Way to the Land of the Philistines. This is also going to be called the Via Maris. This is the famous highway from Egypt to Mesopotamia that runs through Israel. Goes up past Megiddo and on past the Sea of Galilee, then on to Damascus and on up to the Euphrates and into Mesopotamia. The Way of the Land of the Philistines is that route. And that particularly was forbidden to Israel. Can't go that way, not allowed to go that way. The next route to the south is called the Way of Shur, or the Way of the Wilderness of Shur. Now that's a real possibility. That would have been the shortest route to Kadesh Barnea and up to Beersheba. Unfortunately, that's an unlikely route for anyone to take with sheep and goats and women and children. The oasis points are just too far apart, and people on foot are simply not able to go far enough to make it across the desert at that place. That leads us to the third route, which is called the Hajj Road. The Hajj Road from Egypt to Saudi Arabia crosses through the sandstone desert from Mara, perhaps, to Etzion Geber, Solomon's port on the Gulf of Aqaba, and from Etzion Geber into the Hijaz to Mecca. That's called the Hajj Road. There's evidence that this was a caravan route from very ancient times. And today there are several scholars who are arguing that this could have been the route of the Exodus. The majority of conservative scholars hold, however, to a fourth route, the so-called southern route, that's in the dark blue on this map. This takes us out of Ramesses Avaris, number 1, down through Sukkot, to the wilderness of Etam, number 3, past Migdal or Pi Hahiroth or Baal-zephon, which is the place of the crossing of the Sea of Reeds. I think that Israel probably crossed one of the bitter lakes. I'm afraid we really don't know which one. I believe from there, the route goes south through Mara, then on to Elim, Bir Nasab, into the wilderness of sin. The wilderness of sin relates to the moon god, Sin. The name Sinai comes from the wilderness of sin. At the interior of that rocky southern part of Sinai is Mount Sinai itself, possibly. There are 5 mountains in the region that are possible. From there, the route to the wilderness takes us toward the Gulf of Aqaba, ultimately to Kadesh Barnea. And Kadesh Barnea is the location of most of the 40 years of the wanderness wildering in the wilderness of Zin, which is here in that what we call today the Negev desert. Okay, the route looks like this. This is a photograph taken from a bus in the Sinai Peninsula. Not very pretty country. It's pretty in a grand way, but very difficult, very dry. Along the way, God provided manna. The word manna means, what is it? Critics have attempted to say that this happens all the time, but of course it doesn't. If you look under some of these little bushes, you will sometimes find little yellow powdery accretions that are found underneath the leaves of some of these bushes. Those are left by beetles. It's essentially the dung of beetles, and there's no biblical foundation for saying that the Israelites found the beetle poop edible. It's just silly. At any rate, this is where the manna would have come down at first. This is at the base of Mount Sinai. Whichever Mount Sinai we choose, this is at the base of that wilderness area. As you're coming through the middle of that southern Sinai desert, this is what that looks like. The valleys have a reasonable amount of vegetation. They're reasonably flat. It's possible to find water. This location would have given the people of Israel a significant area for camping. A big flat area, sheep and goats could go off and graze, and the people could have found a place to get by. Water from rocks, all of that did in fact happen. And so it required miracles all along the way to keep the people of Israel alive. Nevertheless, this is probably the place. The monastery on this mountain is called St. Catherine's, and it's the oldest continually operating monastery in the world. It goes all the way back to the 4th century of the Christian monasteries. Okay. The correct location of Mount Sinai, I believe, has to be in Sinai, in the Sinai Peninsula. There's some modern adventure type travelers who believe it should be in Saudi Arabia, but it just doesn't work there. At Mount Sinai, a bunch of stuff is going on. This is where the giving of the law happens. And there's a lot happening here. Biblical law, all 640 statutes of biblical law, are based on the 10 Commandments. The feasts and the seasons of the year of Israel are given here. The sacrificial offerings of Leviticus are laid down at Mount Sinai. The priesthood is given to Aaron and his sons. The tabernacle is set up as a place of meeting with God. The golden calf sin happens here at Sinai. The whole thing can be explained as the treaty made by a great king, a suzerain, with a vassal state, Israel. So a famous fellow has written a commentary on Deuteronomy called Treaty of the Great King. because that's exactly what it is. It's a treaty. We have a bit of a problem with the number of people in the Exodus. There should be 3 to 6 million people if you include the mixed multitude. It's unlikely there were so many people. And I believe we have a problem with the numbers, no matter how we go. And I'm not going to walk through that whole thing, but just know that there is a problem. The date of the Exodus is simple on reading the Bible. There you go. You've got Tutmosis IV, the dream stele, which sets him up as the king after Amenhotep II. It has to be there. Egypt, during the Amarna age, was in a time of weakness when Israel was taking up possession of the promised land. In the Amarna letters, the kings of Canaan complain about nomadic people coming in from the desert that they name Habiru. The word Hebrew probably comes from the same root. The people of Israel were probably the Amarna Habiru. When we put all of the dates together, I gave you dates earlier from Solomon, dating back to 1446. When you look at the length of the judges period, 300 years, it's obvious that 1446 works very well. There's a lot of argument for the date of the Exodus. I believe the argument is straightforward and leads us to the so-called early date for the Exodus. Exodus 12 gives us 430 years from Joseph to the Exodus. 1 Kings 6:3, 480 years from the Exodus to the temple dedication. And Judges 11 gives us 300 years for the span of occupation of the Transjordan after the conquest. All of those dates point to an Exodus of 1446 BC. And that's a fairly hard date, by which I mean that's a date that we conservatives really ought to stand for. We ought to not compromise on that date, because every other date assumes that the Bible doesn't mean what it says, that it's wrong, that there's an error here. I don't believe there are errors. As a matter of fact, there's too much that works together to give us an early date for the Exodus. When we come back together on Monday, we're going to go on to a question of first things. This is a good time to do this because Moses here in the Sinai probably compiled the book of Genesis. And he tells the story of everything from the creation to the Tower of Babel. And we have to ask ourselves, is that historical? And if so, are there any stories outside of the Bible that support these biblical bits? So we're going to look on Monday at the extra biblical stuff that in fact does support the biblical narrative. What we're looking at here is a complex set of stories. The details all fit together. All these trivial details all end up fitting together, supporting the biblical narrative. It's again that law of trivial detail. I'm building a case like a lawyer would build a case in a courtroom. All of these bits and pieces come together to support a conservative biblical understanding. So we'll get back together on Monday. And remember, if you're watching from stateside, it's going to be 12:30 Pacific Daylight Time. Every place else in the world, you'll be on your regular time zone. So the regular time will make it happen. Then when we go to Italy time, then things will change again. But we'll let you know as soon as that happens. God bless everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, John.
Love you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
John.
Bye.
All